Before tonight's journey begins, let me know where you're listening from. Now, settle in, let your shoulders soften, let your breathing slow, and allow the day to drift quietly away. Tonight, we travel to Whitby, on the North Yorkshire coast, in November of 1910, to a narrow stone house on Flowergate, where the smell of burnt sugar and boiled marzipan clings to the curtains like a ghost. Among them is Clara Mowbray, a 42-year-old confectioner carrying one copper preserving pan, one leather-bound ledger of recipes, and a grief that has not yet found its proper shape. She expects only a quiet evening by the fire, a cup of tea, and the ordinary comfort of a familiar task. But the night will bring a visitor to her door, a woman with salt-stained boots and a voice like the tide, who will speak of things that cannot be measured in ounces or degrees. This is the story of Clara Mowbray, and of one winter night, when a woman who had spent her life learning to control the precise behavior of sugar discovers that some things must be allowed to crystallize on their own. So close your eyes, breathe gently, and let the sound of the North Sea carry you through copper and caramel and sleep. The kettle was beginning to sing on the range, a thin, rising whistle that had not yet broken into a full boil, and Clara Mowbray stood at her work table, with her hands resting flat on the cool marble, palms down, fingers spread, as though she were pressing a rumour out of the stone. The room was warm, almost too warm, heated by the coal fire that had been burning steadily since 4 o'clock that morning, and the air was thick with the smell of boiled sugar, a scent that had settled into the very walls of the house over the course of 23 years of confectionery. She had been at her work since dawn, as she had been every dawn for as long as she could remember, and the day's production was nearly finished. 12 dozen barley sugars cooling on their trays, 8 rounds of Edinburgh rock wrapped in waxed paper, a single batch of caramels that had not set quite as firmly as she would have liked, and 3 pounds of violet creams that would be sent to the shop on Skinner Street in the morning. She was a small woman, compact and precise in her movements, with gray-streaked hair pinned so tightly beneath her white cap that not a single strand dared to escape. Her hands were steady, as they had to be, and her eyes were the pale blue of a winter sky, clear and watchful and unremarkable. She had been told, once, by a customer who had come all the way from Scarborough to buy her fondant creams, that she had the hands of a surgeon, and she had thought about that compliment for a long time afterwards, turning it over in her mind like a piece of rock sugar on the tongue. She did not think of herself as an artist, or even as a craftswoman of any particular distinction. She was simply a confectioner, and she had been a confectioner since she was 18 years old, which was the year her mother had died and left her alone in the world, with nothing but a single copper preserving pan and a handwritten book of recipes that had been passed down through 3 generations of women who had never had the chance to teach her what they knew. The kettle whistled, and she moved to the stove with the practiced economy of someone who had performed the same sequence of actions thousands of times before. She lifted the kettle from the hob, poured the steaming water into the brown teapot that had belonged to her grandmother, and set it on the tray beside a small jug of milk and a single china cup. She did not take sugar in her tea, which people always found amusing when they learned that she was a confectioner, and she would smile and explain that she had spent so much of her life tasting sugar that her palate had grown weary of it, which was true enough as far as it went, though it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that sugar had become, for her, not a pleasure but a language. She spoke it fluently, in all its dialects, the sharp, clean sweetness of granulated white, the deep, almost savory richness of dark brown muscovado, the thin, floral clarity of castor, the heavy, wet weight of demerara. She could read the behavior of a sugar syrup the way a sailor reads the behavior of the sea, by the way it moved, by the sound it made as it boiled, by the faint, almost imperceptible shift in its clarity as it approached the critical temperature. She had learned that language from her mother, who had learned it from her mother, and she had spent her entire adult life refining it, perfecting it, turning it into something that no one else in Whitby, or perhaps in the whole of North Yorkshire, could match. And yet, for all her skill, for all the precision of her hands and the clarity of her knowledge, there was something that she could not make, something that she had been trying to make for nearly 3 years now, and failing. It was a recipe she had found in her mother's ledger, written in a hand that was not her mother's, a hand that was older and more uncertain, with letters that wobbled and blurred as though the writer had been cold or tired, or perhaps both. The recipe was for a boiled sweet that had no name, only a list of ingredients and a single cryptic instruction. Stir until the color is that of the sea in the hour before the storm. She had tried it 100 times, perhaps more. She had tried it in summer, when the light was long and golden, and in winter, when the kitchen was lit only by the gas lamp and the fire. She had tried it with different sugars, different temperatures, different stirring speeds. She had even tried it at dawn, when the sea was the color of slate and the sky was the color of bone, because she had thought, perhaps, that the instruction was literal, that she was meant to match the color of the sea as it appeared at some particular moment, some particular angle of light, but she had never succeeded. The syrup always turned a muddy gray or a pale, insipid blue, or a brownish green that reminded her of the water in a stagnant pond. It never turned the color of the sea in the hour before the storm. She poured her tea, added a splash of milk, and carried the cup to the small table by the window, where she could look out at the street and watch the November light fade from the sky. The gas lamps were beginning to glow, one by one, casting pools of amber onto the wet cobblestones, and she could hear the sound of footsteps passing by, the low murmur of voices, the distant cry of the fishmonger making his last rounds of the evening. She sat down, cradled the warm cup in her hands, and let out a long, slow breath. She was tired. She was always tired, in a way that had nothing to do with the hours she kept or the work she did. It was a deeper exhaustion, a weariness that had settled into her bones the way the smell of sugar had settled into the walls of her house. And it had been there, she realized, for a very long time. She had been a widow for 9 years, and she had learned to live with the absence of her husband, the way she had learned to live with the absence of her mother, by filling the empty spaces with work, with routine, with the precise and demanding language of sugar. But there were some absences that could not be filled, some silences that could not be broken by the sound of a boiling kettle, and she had stopped trying to pretend otherwise. She finished her tea, washed the cup and saucer in the small stone sink, and dried them with a linen cloth that had been bleached so many times it was almost translucent. She checked the fire, added a small lump of coal, and banked it carefully so that it would burn slowly through the night. She turned down the gas lamp until the flame was a mere whisper of blue, and then she stood in the darkness of her kitchen, listening to the house settle around her, the creak of the floorboards, the faint rustle of the curtains, the distant, rhythmic crash of the sea against the harbor wall. She was not expecting anyone. She was not expecting anything. She was simply waiting, as she had been waiting for 3 years, for the color of the sea in the hour before the storm. The house on Flowergate had been in Clara Mowbray's family for 62 years, though it had not always been a confectioner's shop. Her grandfather, a ship's carpenter from Hull, had bought it in 1848 when the herring trade was booming and Whitby was thick with the masts of fishing boats, and he had filled it with the smell of oak shavings and tar and the sound of his plane moving across a plank of wood. Her mother had inherited the house in 1875, after the old man died of a fever that had taken him in 3 days, and she had turned the front parlor into a small sweet shop, selling boiled sweets and fondant creams, and the occasional batch of Edinburgh Rock to the wives of fishermen and the clerks from the railway office. It was her mother, who had taught Clara the first principles of confectionery, standing beside her at the stove with a hand on her shoulder, guiding the wooden spoon through the thickening syrup in slow, patient circles. Clara's earliest memory was of standing on a wooden crate so that she could reach the work table, her small hands gripping the handle of the spoon, while her mother's voice murmured the temperatures in her ear. Thread, soft ball, firm ball, hard ball, soft crack, hard crack. She had learned those terms before she had learned to read, before she had learned to write her own name, and she had understood them the way a child understands the words for hunger and sleep and love, as things that were simply true, that needed no explanation. The sugar syrup was a living thing, her mother had told her, and like all living things, it had to be treated with respect. You could not rush it, you could not force it, you could only watch and wait and listen, and when it was ready, it would tell you. The memory of that voice, soft and patient and endlessly reassuring, was one of the few things that Clara had kept from her childhood, the way a confectioner keeps a jar of vanilla beans in a dark cupboard, using them sparingly, savoring each one. Her mother had died when Clara was 18, in the autumn of 1886, and the house had passed to her, along with the copper pan and the ledger and the recipe for the unnamed sweet that she had never been able to make. She had closed the shop for 3 months, which was the longest period of inactivity she had ever allowed herself, and when she reopened it, she had offered a new line of violet creams that had become so popular that people came from as far away as Middlesbrough to buy them. She had not, at the time, thought of this as a way of grieving. She had thought of it simply as work, as the next thing to be done, as the natural continuation of a life that had been interrupted, but not, she had told herself, fundamentally altered. But she had been wrong. She knew that now, sitting in the dim kitchen of her house, watching the fire settle into its slow, steady burn. She had been wrong about many things in the years since her mother's death, and in the years since her husband's death, and she had learned to accept her wrongness, the way she had learned to accept the failures of her unnamed sweet, as something that could not be fixed, only endured. Her husband, Thomas Mowbray, had been a printer, a quiet man with ink-stained fingers and a habit of humming hymns under his breath while he worked. He had died in the winter of 1901, of a pneumonia that had taken him in a week, and Clara had found herself alone in the house on Flowergate, with nothing but the copper pan and the ledger and the memory of his voice, humming, "Abide with me," in the dark of the bedroom, while the wind rattled the windows and the sea crashed against the harbor wall. She had not wept, not then. She had not wept at his funeral, or in the days that followed, or in the months that stretched into years. She had simply continued, the way the tide continues, rising and falling, advancing and retreating, indifferent to the grief that it carried with it. It was only recently, in the last year or so, that she had begun to feel the weight of that grief, pressing down on her, like the lid of a copper pan, heavy and unyielding. She had begun to wake in the night, not with a start, not with a cry, but simply open her eyes in the darkness and lie there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence. She had begun to forget things, small things, like the name of a regular customer or the temperature at which a particular sugar would crack. She had begun to feel, for the first time in her life, that she was running out of time, that the house on Flowergate and the copper pan and the ledger were all that she had, and that they were not enough. She had tried to tell herself that this was a natural part of aging, a phase that would pass, a mood that would lift with the spring. But the spring had come and gone, and the summer had bloomed and faded, and November had arrived with its gray skies and its cold rain and its long, dark evenings, and the feeling had not lifted. It had settled into her, the way a syrup settles into a mold, taking on the shape of whatever container holds it, and she had begun to understand that she was not waiting for the feeling to pass. She was waiting for something else, something she could not name, something that had been waiting for her all along. She rose from her chair and walked to the front of the house, where the shop window faced the street. The gas lamps were burning steadily now, their light falling on the wet cobblestones and the empty pavement, and she could see the reflection of her own face in the glass, pale and faint and ghostly, like a sweet that had been left too long in the pan. She stood there for a long time, watching the street, watching the occasional figure pass by, wrapped in a coat and hat, hurrying home to a warm fire and a hot meal and a life that was not hers. And then, just as she was about to turn away, she saw something that made her stop. A figure was standing at the end of the street, at the corner where Flowergate met Church Street, a figure that was not moving, that was simply standing there, watching the house. Clara could not make out the details, could not see the face or the clothing, but she could feel the weight of the gaze, the stillness of the body, the strange, unsettling patience of it. She waited, holding her breath, her hand pressed against the glass, but the figure did not move, did not approach, did not do anything that might explain its presence. It simply stood there, a dark shape against the amber glow of the gas lamp, and then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. Clara let out her breath, a long, slow exhale that clouded the glass in front of her face. She told herself that it was nothing, that it was a trick of the light, that she was tired and imagining things. She told herself that there was no one standing at the end of the street, that there was no one watching the house, that there was nothing to be afraid of. She told herself these things, and she almost believed them. But as she turned away from the window and walked back to the kitchen, she could not shake the feeling that something had changed, that the night had shifted in some subtle, imperceptible way, and that the hour of the storm was drawing near. She woke the next morning, as she always did, at 5:15, when the sky was still black and the gas lamps were still burning, and the only sound in the house was the ticking of the clock in the hallway. She lay in bed for a few moments, not moving, not thinking, simply letting the darkness settle around her like a blanket, and then she swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood up. The floor was cold against her bare feet, and she shivered as she pulled on her dressing gown and lit the candle that she kept on the nightstand. She had a gas lamp in the kitchen, and another in the shop, and a third in the small room upstairs where she kept her supplies. But she always lit a candle first, in the dark of the bedroom, as if to mark the transition from sleep to waking, from the world of dreams to the world of sugar. She made her way down the stairs, her hand trailing along the wall for balance, and entered the kitchen. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing embers, and she added a few pieces of kindling and a lump of coal, coaxing the flames back to life with the patience of someone who had performed this ritual 1,000 times. She filled the kettle, set it on the hob, and then she turned to the work table, where the copper pan was waiting for her. It was a beautiful pan, the copper pan, with a deep, curving belly and a long, sturdy handle, its surface polished to a warm, reddish glow by years of use. It had belonged to her grandmother and to her mother, and now it belonged to her, and she treated it with the kind of reverence that other women reserved for jewelry or fine china. She washed it carefully, dried it with a soft cloth, and set it on the stove, where it would be ready for the first batch of the day. Today she would be making honeycomb, that light, airy confection of sugar and golden syrup and bicarbonate of soda that shattered into 1,000 pieces when you bit into it, releasing a burst of sweetness that lingered on the tongue like a memory. It was one of her most popular items, sold in the shop on Skinner Street and in the tea rooms along the West Cliff, and she had made it so many times that she could do it in her sleep, measuring the ingredients by eye, stirring the syrup in a rhythm that was as natural as breathing. She measured out 2 pounds of granulated sugar, added 4 ounces of golden syrup and a cup of water, and set the pan over a medium heat. She did not stir immediately, because the first rule of confectionery is that you do not stir a sugar syrup until it has come to a full boil, and she had broken that rule exactly once, as an apprentice, and had never broken it again. She waited, watching the sugar dissolve, watching the surface of the liquid grow clear and still, and then she dipped a clean pastry brush into a cup of cold water and brushed the sides of the pan, washing away any stray crystals that might cause the syrup to seize. It was a delicate operation, the making of honeycomb, because the temperature had to be exactly right. The syrup had to be cooked to the hard crack stage, 300 degrees Fahrenheit, and if you overshot it by even a degree, the honeycomb would be too dark, too bitter, too brittle. If you undershot it, it would be too soft, too sticky, too chewy. There was a narrow window of perfection, a brief moment when the syrup was exactly right, and you had to catch it, to seize it, to pour it into the waiting tin before it passed you by. Clara had learned to catch that moment by sound, by the way the syrup hissed and bubbled, by the way it clung to the spoon, by the way it changed from a bright, clear liquid to a thick, golden syrup that moved with the slow, deliberate grace of honey. She had learned to read the temperature with her ears, her eyes, her hands, her very skin, and she had learned to trust that reading, to act on it without hesitation, because hesitation was the enemy of good confectionery. The syrup reached the hard crack stage, and she lifted the pan from the heat, added the bicarbonate of soda, and stirred it in a single, swift motion. The mixture foamed and rose, turning pale and light and airy, and she poured it into the greased tin, spreading it evenly with the back of a spoon. She set the tin aside to cool, and then she stood back, looking at the honeycomb, watching it set, watching it firm, watching it become what it was meant to be. She had done this 1,000 times, and she would do it 1,000 times more, and she would never tire of it, never grow bored of it, never lose the sense of wonder that came with watching a few simple ingredients transform into something that was greater than the sum of its parts. It was not magic what she did, it was science, and it was craft, and it was knowledge, and it was love, and it was all of those things together, woven into a single, seamless act of creation. She worked through the morning, making batch after batch, filling the house with the smell of sugar and caramel and vanilla, and she did not think about the figure she had seen at the end of the street, or the feeling of being watched, or the strange, unsettling stillness of the night before. She thought only of the sugar, of the temperature, of the precise and demanding language that she had spent her whole life learning to speak. She thought of her mother, standing beside her at the stove, guiding her hand through the motions of the craft. She thought of her husband, humming hymns in the dark of the bedroom, his ink-stained fingers tracing patterns on the sheets. She thought of all the years she had spent in this house, at this table, with this pan, and she thought of all the years that were still to come, and she wondered, for the first time in a long time, what they would bring. At noon, she stopped, wiped her hands on her apron, and sat down at the table with a cup of tea and a slice of bread and butter. The shop on Skinner Street would send a boy to collect the day's orders at 3 o'clock, and she would have to finish the violet creams before then. But for now, she allowed herself a few moments of stillness, of quiet, of rest. She looked out the window, at the gray sky and the gray street and the gray houses, and she felt a sudden, sharp pang of loneliness, so acute that it took her breath away. She had never been a woman who craved company. She had always been content with her own thoughts, her own work, her own quiet life. But lately, something had shifted, something had changed, and she had begun to feel the absence of other people, the way she had once felt the absence of her mother and her husband and the unnamed sweet that she had never been able to make. It was a hollow feeling, a hollow place in the center of her chest, and she did not know how to fill it. She finished her tea, washed the cup and saucer, and returned to the work table. She had violet creams to make, and a batch of Edinburgh rock to wrap, and a dozen jars of honeycomb to label and seal. She had work to do, and she did it, because that was what she had always done, and that was what she would always do, until the day she could no longer stand at the stove and stir the syrup and read the temperature in the language of her hands. The afternoon passed in the familiar rhythm of small tasks, each one flowing into the next with the smooth, unhurried grace of a well-tended fire. Clara wrapped the Edinburgh rock in waxed paper, twisting the ends into neat little curls that reminded her, for no reason she could name, of the ribbons her mother had worn in her hair. She labeled the jars of honeycomb with a small, careful hand, writing the date and the price and the words, Mowbray's Confectionery, Whitby, in black ink that smelled of cloves. She packed the violet creams into a wooden box lined with tissue paper, arranging them in neat rows, each one a perfect, pale violet, dusted with a fine layer of castor sugar that caught the light like frost. The boy from the shop arrived at 3:10, a lad of 12 or 13 with a cap pulled down over his ears and a scarf wound so tightly around his neck that only his nose and eyes were visible. He took the box and the jars and the wrapped sweets, loading them onto a handcart with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing this work for years, and he tipped his cap to Clara as he left, the way he always did, the way his father had done before him, when he was a boy of 12 or 13, and Clara was a young woman of 23, newly married and newly in charge of the shop. She watched him go, his figure growing smaller and smaller as he made his way down Flowergate, and then she closed the door and stood in the quiet of the hallway, listening to the silence. The house felt emptier than usual, somehow, as though the boy had taken something with him that he had not meant to take, something that had been keeping the walls from pressing in on themselves. She shook her head, dismissing the thought as the product of a tired mind, and she walked back to the kitchen to begin the preparations for the next day's work. She was weighing out a batch of fondant sugar when she heard the knock at the door. It was not a loud knock, not insistent, not demanding. It was a soft, tentative knock, the kind of knock that a person might make if they were not entirely sure they wanted to be heard. She set down the scoop, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked to the front of the house, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The figure standing on her doorstep was a woman, perhaps 60 years old, perhaps older, with gray hair pulled back from a face that was weathered and lined and brown from the sun. She wore a long, dark coat that had seen better days, and boots that were caked with dried mud, and she carried a canvas bag that hung from her shoulder by a frayed leather strap. She was not the figure from the night before, the figure that had stood at the end of the street and watched the house, but there was something about her, something in the stillness of her posture, something in the way she held herself, that made Clara think of the sea. "Mrs. Mowbray," the woman said, and her voice was low and rough, like the sound of stones rolling in the surf. "Yes," Clara said, standing in the doorway, her hand still on the handle. "Can I help you?" The woman smiled, a small, tired smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "I was told that you make the best violet creams in Whitby," she said. "I wondered if I might buy a few." Clara hesitated. The shop was closed, the day's work was done, and she was tired, more tired than she had realized. But there was something in the woman's face, something in the way she stood, something in the quiet, patient quality of her voice, that made her step aside and hold the door open. "Come in," she said. "I have a few left, I think. They're in the kitchen." The woman stepped inside, and Clara closed the door behind her, leading her through the narrow hallway and into the warm, sugar-scented kitchen. She pulled out a chair, and the woman sat down, setting her canvas bag on the floor beside her, and Clara went to the cupboard where she kept the spare boxes of sweets, taking down a small box of violet creams and setting it on the table. "Would you like a cup of tea?" Clara asked, and the woman nodded, and Clara filled the kettle and set it on the hob, and for a few minutes, the only sound in the kitchen was the soft hiss of the gas flame and the steady, rhythmic ticking of the clock. The woman did not speak. She simply sat, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the box of violet creams, as though she were reading something in the pale, delicate shapes of the sweets. Clara watched her, feeling the weight of the silence, and she found herself wondering who this woman was, where she had come from, what had brought her to her door on a cold November evening. "I used to make violet creams," the woman said, finally, her voice low and thoughtful. "Many years ago, in a different place, a different life, I had forgotten how beautiful they are." Clara did not know what to say, so she said nothing. She poured the tea, handed a cup to the woman, and sat down across from her, wrapping her own hands around the warm porcelain. The woman took a sip of tea, set the cup down, and looked at Clara with a gaze that was both steady and distant, as though she were seeing two things at once: the woman sitting across from her, and something else, something far away, something that had happened a long time ago. "I am not here for the violet creams," she said. "I am here because I heard, from a woman in the market, that you have been trying to make a sweet that no one in Whitby has ever seen, a sweet that is the color of the sea in the hour before the storm." Clara felt a cold shiver run down her spine, the kind of shiver that comes not from cold, but from recognition, from the sudden, unsettling feeling that something you have been carrying alone for a long time has been seen by someone else. "How do you know about that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman smiled, and her smile was full of secrets. "Because I know the recipe," she said. "I know the recipe, and I know the name of the sweet, and I know why you have not been able to make it, but I will not tell you those things tonight. Tonight, I will only ask you a question." She leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Clara's, and her voice dropped to a murmur that was almost lost in the sound of the fire. "Tell me, Mrs. Mowbray, have you ever seen the sea in the hour before the storm?" The question hung in the air between them, a single, simple sentence that seemed to contain more weight than any question Clara had ever been asked. She sat in her chair, her hands still wrapped around the warm cup of tea, and she looked at the woman across from her, at the weathered face and the steady eyes and the small, knowing smile that played at the corners of her mouth. "I have seen the sea," Clara said, slowly, carefully, as though she were testing each word before she let it leave her mouth. "I have seen it, in every season, in every weather, in every light. I have lived in Whitby my whole life. I have walked along the harbor wall 1,000 times. I have watched the tide come in and go out, and I have watched the gulls wheel and cry, and I have watched the fishing boats return with their catch. But I cannot say that I have ever seen the sea in the hour before the storm, not the way you mean." The woman nodded, as though she had expected this answer, as though she had known it before she had even asked the question. "Then you must come with me," she said. "You must come with me, and you must see it for yourself." Clara stared at her. "Come with you? Where?" "To the harbor," the woman said. "To the end of the pier. There is a storm coming, Mrs. Mowbray. I can feel it in my bones, the way I have always felt it, and before the storm arrives, there will be a moment, a single moment, when the sea will be the color that you have been trying to capture in your sugar. I will show it to you, if you will let me." Clara felt a flutter of something in her chest, something that was not quite fear, not quite excitement, not quite hope. It was a feeling she had not experienced in a very long time, a feeling that was as unfamiliar as it was unsettling, and she did not know what to do with it. "It is almost dark," she said, "and the wind is rising. It is not safe to walk along the pier in the dark. It is safe, the woman said, with a certainty that brooked no argument. I have walked along that pier in every weather, in every season, in every light. I know the stones, and I know the tide, and I know the wind. You will be safe with me. Clara looked at the window, at the darkening sky, at the bare branches of the tree that grew in the small yard behind the house, swaying and bending in the rising wind. She looked at the copper pan, still sitting on the stove, cold and empty. She looked at the ledger, open on the table, with the recipe for the unnamed sweet written in that old, uncertain hand. She thought of her mother, standing beside her at the stove, guiding her hand through the motions of the craft. She thought of her husband, humming hymns in the dark of the bedroom, his ink-stained fingers tracing patterns on the sheets. She thought of all the years she had spent in this house, at this table, with this pan, and she thought of all the years that were still to come, and she wondered, for the first time in a long time, what it would be like to step outside, to leave the warmth and the safety and the familiar scent of sugar, and to walk into the unknown. "All right," she said, and the words felt strange on her tongue, as though she had borrowed them from someone else. "I will come with you." She stood up, took off her apron, and hung it on the hook by the door. She pulled on her coat, a heavy wool coat that had belonged to her husband, and she wrapped a scarf around her neck and pulled a hat down over her ears. She took the key from the hook, unlocked the door, and stepped out into the cold, dark evening. The woman followed her, her canvas bag slung over her shoulder, and together they walked down Flowergate, past the darkened houses and the shuttered shops, towards the sound of the sea. The wind was stronger now, carrying the salt and the spray and the smell of wet stone, and the gas lamps flickered and swayed, casting long, dancing shadows on the cobblestones. They reached Church Street, and then they turned down towards the harbor, the road sloping gently downwards, the sound of the waves growing louder with every step. Clara could see the masts of the fishing boats rising and falling against the dark sky, and she could hear the creak of the rigging and the slap of the water against the hulls. The harbor was quiet, the boats tied up for the night, the fishermen gone home to their fires and their families, and the only sound was the wind and the sea and the crunch of their footsteps on the gravel. The woman led her to the end of the pier, a long stone arm that stretched out into the darkness, and they stood at the edge, looking out at the water. The sea was dark, almost black, but there was a light on the horizon, a faint, silvery glow that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. And as Clara watched, the color began to change. It was not a sudden change, not a dramatic shift, but a slow, gradual transformation, like the melting of sugar in a warm pan. The black became gray, and the gray became green, and the green became a deep, rich, luminous blue, the color of a storm sky at twilight, the color of a wave breaking over a reef, the color of something that was both beautiful and terrible, both calm and wild. "That is it," the woman said, her voice low and reverent. "That is the color of the sea in the hour before the storm. That is what you have been trying to make." Clara stared at the water, at the shifting, shimmering, impossible color, and she felt a lump rise in her throat, a feeling of recognition that was so deep and so profound that it brought tears to her eyes. "I have never seen anything like it," she whispered. "I have never seen anything so beautiful." "No," the woman said, "you have not, and you will not see it again. Not like this, not tonight, but you will remember it. You will hold it in your mind, in your heart, in your hands, and you will know, when you return to your kitchen, what it is that you are trying to make." They stood on the pier for a long time, watching the sea shift and change, the color deepening and fading and deepening again, until the sky grew dark and the first drops of rain began to fall, cold and sharp against their faces. The woman touched Clara's arm, a light, gentle touch, and she turned and led the way back along the pier, towards the lights of the town. They did not speak as they walked. The wind was too strong, the rain too loud, and the sound of the waves crashing against the stone was a constant, rhythmic presence that seemed to fill the world. Clara followed the woman through the narrow streets, past the fish market and the old church and the rows of terraced houses, until they came to a small cottage on a lane that Clara did not recognize, a lane that was so narrow and so dark that it seemed to have been forgotten by the rest of the world. The woman pushed open the door, and they stepped inside, into a room that was warm and dim and filled with the smell of wood smoke and salt. A fire was burning in the grate, and there was a kettle on the hob, and a cat was curled up on a threadbare armchair, its eyes half closed, its tail twitching in its sleep. "Sit down," the woman said, gesturing to the chair opposite the fire. "I will make us some tea." Clara sat down, and she watched as the woman moved about the small room, filling the kettle, setting out cups, taking a tin of biscuits from a cupboard. She moved with the same quiet, unhurried grace that she had shown on the pier, and Clara found herself wondering who this woman was, where she had come from, what had brought her to this small cottage on this forgotten lane. "My name is Margaret," the woman said, as though she had heard Clara's thoughts. "Margaret Harker. I was born in this cottage 67 years ago, and I have lived here my whole life. My father was a fisherman, and my husband was a fisherman, and my sons were fishermen, and I have spent more years than I can count watching the sea, watching the sky, watching the weather, waiting for the boats to come home." She poured the tea, handed a cup to Clara, and sat down in the chair opposite her, cradling her own cup in her hands. The firelight flickered across her face, illuminating the lines and the creases and the deep, dark circles under her eyes, and Clara saw, for the first time, the weight of the years that she carried. "My husband died at sea," Margaret said, her voice flat, matter-of-fact, as though she were speaking of something that had happened to someone else. 23 years ago, a storm came up, sudden and fierce, and his boat was caught in it. They found the wreckage the next day, scattered along the shore, but they never found him. They never found any of them. Clara did not know what to say. She had heard stories like this before, of course, stories of fishermen lost at sea, of widows left to raise their children alone, of the endless, relentless grief that came with living in a town that was built on the edge of the ocean. But hearing it from Margaret, sitting in the warm, quiet cottage, watching the firelight play across her face, was different. It was real, and it was present, and it was something that Clara recognized, deep in her own bones. "I am sorry," Clara said, and the words felt inadequate, hollow, as empty as the sea. Margaret shrugged, a small, weary gesture. "It was a long time ago," she said. "I have learned to live with it. I have learned to live with the absence, the way you learn to live with a missing limb. You adapt. You find a way to move forward, even if you are not moving the way you used to." She took a sip of her tea, and then she set the cup down and looked at Clara with a gaze that was both knowing and kind. "I heard about you," she said. "I heard about the sweet you have been trying to make. I heard about the recipe in your mother's ledger and the instruction that no one can understand. I heard that you have been trying to make it for 3 years and that you have failed every time." Clara nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "I know why you have failed," Margaret said. "It is not because you lack the skill. It is not because you lack the knowledge. It is because you have been trying to make the color of the sea without understanding what the sea is, what it means, what it carries with it." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The sea is not a color, Mrs. Mowbray. It is a feeling, it is a memory. It is the sound of a boat that never came home, and the taste of salt on a widow's lips, and the weight of a grief that is so deep and so vast that it cannot be measured in any unit that we have. You cannot make the color of the sea by mixing sugar and water and heat. You can only make it by mixing sugar and water and heat, and something else, something that you have been carrying inside you for a very long time. Clara felt a tear slide down her cheek, and she did not wipe it away. She sat in the warm, dim room, with the fire crackling, and the cat purring, and the rain beating against the window, and she let the tears fall. The first tears she had shed in 9 years, the first tears she had shed since the day her husband had died. "What is that something?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Margaret smiled, and her smile was full of the same secrets that Clara had seen on the pier, the same depth, the same wisdom, the same quiet, patient understanding. "You know what it is," she said. "You have always known. You have just been afraid to name it." The rain had stopped by the time Clara left Margaret's cottage, but the wind was still blowing, and the clouds were still moving across the sky, and the sea was still dark and restless, churning against the harbor wall. She walked home through the empty streets, her hands in her pockets, her head bowed against the wind, and she thought about what Margaret had said. "You know what it is. You have always known. You have just been afraid to name it." She had known, of course. She had known from the very beginning, from the moment she had first read the recipe in her mother's ledger, from the moment she had first tried to make the unnamed sweet, from the moment she had first failed. She had known what was missing, what was needed, what it would take to make the color of the sea in the hour before the storm. She had just been too afraid to admit it, too afraid to open the door that she had kept closed for so long, too afraid to let the grief in. She reached the house on Flowergate, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The kitchen was warm and dark. The fire burned down to embers, and the copper pan was still sitting on the stove, cold and empty. She lit the gas lamp, and the light filled the room, casting long, soft shadows across the walls. She took off her coat and her scarf and her hat, and she hung them on the hook by the door. She walked to the work table, and she opened the ledger, and she turned to the page with the recipe for the unnamed sweet, the recipe that had been written in that old uncertain hand, the recipe that she had tried to make 100 times and failed. She read the ingredients: sugar, water, cream of tartar, glucose, a pinch of salt. She read the instruction: stir until the color is that of the sea in the hour before the storm. She had followed those instructions 100 times, measuring the ingredients with precision, heating the syrup to the exact temperature, stirring with the exact rhythm, and she had failed, every time, because she had been missing one thing, one ingredient that was not written in the ledger, one ingredient that could not be measured in ounces or degrees. She reached into the pocket of her coat, and she pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, the paper that Margaret had given her as she was leaving the cottage. She unfolded it, and she read the words that were written in Margaret's shaky, unsteady hand. The color of the sea in the hour before the storm is the color of grief. It is the color of the moment when you realize that the boat is not coming home, that the voice is not coming back, that the person you loved more than anything in the world is gone, and that you are alone. It is the color of the tears that you have been holding back for years, the tears that you have been too afraid to shed, the tears that have been waiting for you, patient and relentless, like the tide. You cannot make the color of the sea in the hour before the storm until you have let yourself feel the storm. You cannot make it until you have let yourself weep. Clara read the words, and she read them again, and then she folded the paper and put it back in her pocket. She stood at the work table, looking at the copper pan, and she felt the tears welling up again, the tears that she had been holding back for 9 years, the tears that she had been too afraid to shed. She let them fall. She did not fight them. She did not try to hold them back. She stood in the warm, dim kitchen, with the gas lamp burning and the fire crackling, and the copper pan waiting on the stove, and she let the tears fall, streaming down her cheeks, dripping onto the work table, onto the open ledger, onto the recipe that had been written in her mother's hand. She wept for her mother, who had died too young, who had left her alone in the world with nothing but a copper pan and a book of recipes. She wept for her husband, who had died in the winter of 1901, who had been taken by a pneumonia that had come on so quickly that she had not even had time to say goodbye. She wept for the life she had imagined, the life she had planned, the life that had been taken from her before she had had a chance to live it. She wept until she had no tears left, until her eyes were dry and her throat was raw and her chest was empty, and then she stood up, wiped her face with her sleeve, and turned to the stove. She lit the gas, set the copper pan over the flame, and began to measure the ingredients: sugar, water, cream of tartar, glucose, a pinch of salt. She added them to the pan, one by one, and she stirred them together, watching the mixture dissolve, watching it become clear, watching it begin to bubble and hiss. She did not think about the temperature. She did not think about the time. She did not think about the instruction that had baffled her for 3 years. She simply stirred, and she let her mind drift, and she let her heart open, and she let the grief flow through her, into the syrup, into the copper pan, into the color that was beginning to form. And as she stirred, the syrup began to change. It turned from clear to pale, from pale to gray, from gray to a deep, rich, luminous blue, the color of the sea in the hour before the storm, the color that she had seen on the pier, the color that she had been trying to capture for 3 years. She lifted the pan from the heat, and she poured the syrup into the waiting tin, and she watched it set, watched it cool, watched it become what it was meant to be. And when it was ready, she broke off a piece, and she held it up to the light, and she saw that it was perfect, that it was the color of the sea, that it was the color of grief, that it was the color of the storm that had been building inside her for 9 years. She put the piece in her mouth, and she let the piece of candy dissolved on Clara's tongue, and for a moment she stood motionless in the kitchen, the gas lamp hissing softly, the fire settling in the grate. The flavor was not sweet, not in the way she had expected. It was salt, and it was darkness, and it was the deep, cold breath of the North Sea on a winter morning. It was the sound of waves breaking against rocks, the cry of gulls wheeling over the harbor, the creak of rigging in the wind. It was the color of grief, yes, but also the color of something else, something that she could not yet name, something that was waiting for her just beyond the edge of understanding. She swallowed, and the taste lingered, a residue of memory and salt and light. She set the remaining piece of candy on the work table, and she looked at the way the gaslight caught the edges, at the way it seemed to hold the darkness inside it, at the way it was both solid and fluid, both here and somewhere else, both hers and not hers. She did not eat another piece. She covered the tin with a clean cloth, and she turned off the gas, and she banked the fire for the night. She climbed the stairs to her bedroom, and she lay down on the bed, still dressed, still awake, still holding the taste of the sea in her mouth. And she thought about Margaret, about the old woman who lived in the cottage at the end of the pier, the woman who had seen the same color, who had known the same grief, who had given her the words that she had needed to hear. The next morning, Clara woke to the sound of rain again, a steady, drumming rain that filled the street and the harbor and the sky. She dressed slowly, her limbs heavy with the sleep that had finally come, a deep, dreamless sleep that had taken her somewhere she had not been in 9 years. She made tea, and she ate a piece of bread and butter, and she looked at the tin on the work table, the tin that held the candy that she had made, the candy that was the color of the sea in the hour before the storm. She decided to go back to Margaret's cottage. She needed to thank her, and she needed to ask her something that had been forming in her mind since the candy had set, since she had tasted it, since she had felt the grief move through her and out of her, like a tide that had finally turned. She put on her coat and her scarf and her hat, and she took the tin with her, wrapped in a cloth, tucked under her arm. She walked through the rain, past the shops on Flowergate, past the church, past the Whitby Arms, down the long slope of Church Street, past the fishing sheds and the net menders, past the smell of tar and salt and wet wood, until she reached the pier. The sea was gray today, a flat, sullen gray that matched the sky. The waves were small, lapping against the stones, and the gulls were huddled on the rooftops, their feathers ruffled, their heads tucked under their wings. The wind was cold, but it was not the sharp, biting wind of the previous day. It was a damp wind, a wind that carried the rain into your bones, a wind that made you want to be inside, by a fire with a cup of tea. Clara knocked on Margaret's door, and the same long pause came, and then the door opened, and Margaret stood there, wrapped in her shawl, her white hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes bright and clear. "You came back," Margaret said, and she smiled. "I thought you might." "I brought you something," Clara said, holding out the tin. "I made it. Last night. I followed your advice." Margaret took the tin, and she unwrapped the cloth, and she lifted the lid. She looked at the candy, at the deep, luminous blue, the color of the sea in the hour before the storm, and she nodded, slowly, her face softening. "You did it," she said. "You really did it." She stepped aside, and Clara stepped into the cottage, into the warm, dim room, into the smell of wood smoke and lavender and old books. The fire was crackling, the cat was curled on the hearth, the kettle was singing on the hob. Margaret set the tin on the table, and she broke off a small piece of the candy, and she put it in her mouth. She closed her eyes, and she stood still, and she let the candy dissolve on her tongue. When she opened her eyes again, there were tears in them, tears that she did not wipe away. "You have captured it," she said. "You have captured the sea, but you have also captured something else, something that is even more difficult to capture." "What is that?" Clara asked. "The moment after the storm," Margaret said. "The moment when the rain stops, and the wind dies, and the clouds begin to break, and the first thin light of the sun comes through. You have made the color of the sea in the hour before the storm, yes, but you have also made the color of the sea in the hour after the storm, the hour when the sea begins to calm, when the grief begins to settle, when you begin to believe that you might survive." She looked at Clara, and her gaze was full of the same depth, the same wisdom, the same quiet, patient understanding. "You have made the color of the sea," she said, "and you have made the color of the sea's forgiveness. You have made the color of the sea's peace." Clara stood in the warm, dim room, with the fire crackling, and the cat purring, and the rain beating against the window, and she felt something shift inside her, something that she had not known was there, something that had been waiting for her, patient and relentless, like the tide. "What do I do now?" she asked. Margaret smiled, and she broke off another piece of the candy, and she held it out to Clara. "You eat it," she said, "and then you go for a walk along the cliffs, and you let the sea teach you the rest." Clara left the cottage with the taste of the candy still on her tongue, a taste that was salt and light and the memory of the storm. She walked along the pier, past the fishing boats that were tied up for the day, their masts bare, their hulls dripping with rain. She walked past the lifeboat station, past the old stone steps that led up to the east cliff, and she began to climb. The steps were wet and slippery, worn smooth by generations of feet, by the rain and the wind and the salt spray. She climbed slowly, carefully, her hand on the iron railing, her breath coming in short, white puffs in the cold air. The rain had stopped, but the clouds were still low and gray, and the sea was still flat and sullen, and the world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something that had not yet arrived. She reached the top of the cliff, and she stood on the grass, looking out at the sea. The wind was stronger here, a steady, damp wind that pushed against her, that tugged at her coat and her scarf and her hat. She turned to the left, towards the abbey, and she began to walk along the cliff path, the path that wound through the grass, past the gravestones of St. Mary's churchyard, past the old chapel, past the ruins of the abbey that stood on the headland, dark and ancient and silent. The abbey had been a ruin for 400 years, its walls broken by the wind and the rain and the sea, its windows empty, its roof open to the sky. Clara had walked past it 100 times, but she had never really seen it, not the way she saw it now. She saw the way the stones were worn, the way the lichen grew on them, the way the light filtered through the empty windows, the way the wind moved through the arches, carrying the sound of the sea. She walked around the abbey, past the old cloisters, past the foundations of the chapter house, past the place where the monks had once walked, had once prayed, had once lived their quiet, orderly lives, far from the world, far from the sea, far from the grief that was waiting for them, patient and relentless, like the tide. She stopped at the edge of the cliff, and she looked down at the sea. The water was gray, the same gray as the sky, and the waves were small, rolling in from the north, breaking against the rocks below, sending up a fine spray that the wind caught and carried away. She could see the harbor, the fishing boats, the pier, the rows of houses that climbed the hill, the smoke rising from the chimneys, the lights that were just beginning to come on in the windows. She stood there for a long time, not thinking, not feeling, just standing, just being, just letting the wind and the sea and the sky do their work. She felt the cold on her face, the damp on her coat, the ground beneath her feet, the solid, ancient rock of the cliff, the rock that had been here for millions of years, that had seen storms and ships and grief and joy, that had seen everything and nothing, that had remained patient and relentless, like the tide. She thought about her mother, about the old, uncertain hand that had written the recipe, about the woman who had taught her to stir, to measure, to heat, to wait. She thought about her husband, about the way he had smiled, about the way he had laughed, about the way he had held her, about the way he had left her, about the way she had been carrying him inside her, like a stone, for 9 years. And she thought about the candy that she had made, the candy that was the color of the sea, the candy that was the color of grief, the candy that was the color of forgiveness. She thought about the copper pan, the pan that had been her mother's, the pan that had been her grandmother's, the pan that had been handed down from one generation to the next, carrying the heat and the sugar and the water and the salt, carrying the colors, carrying the memories, carrying the grief. She turned away from the cliff, and she walked back along the path, past the abbey, past the graveyard, past the old chapel, down the steps, through the streets, until she reached the house on Flowergate. She unlocked the door, and she stepped inside, and she lit the gas lamp, and she looked at the copper pan, sitting on the stove, cold and empty and waiting. She took off her coat and her scarf and her hat, and she hung them on the hook by the door. She walked to the work table, and she opened the ledger, and she turned to the page with the recipe for the unnamed sweet, the recipe that she had tried to make 100 times and failed. She read the ingredients, the instruction, the old, uncertain hand that had written them, and she smiled. She did not need to make the candy again, not yet. She needed to let the taste of it settle, to let the memory of it become part of her, to let the sea teach her the rest, as Margaret had said. She closed the ledger, and she went upstairs, and she lay down on the bed, and she closed her eyes. She could hear the rain, still falling, still drumming, still filling the street and the harbor and the sky. She could hear the gulls calling to each other, their voices carried on the wind. She could hear the sea, the constant, rhythmic sound of the waves breaking against the shore again and again, patient and relentless like the tide. And she fell asleep, not to the sound of the sea, but to the taste of it, the taste of the candy that she had made, the taste of the color of the sea in the hour before the storm, the taste of the color of the sea in the hour after the storm, the taste of the sea's forgiveness, the taste of the sea's peace. The next day, Clara returned to the cottage at the end of the pier. The rain had stopped, and the sun was trying to break through the clouds, a thin, pale light that cast long shadows across the harbor. The sea was still gray, but it was a lighter gray now, a gray that was touched with silver, a gray that seemed to hold the promise of something brighter. Margaret was sitting in the window, a book open on her lap, a cup of tea at her elbow. The cat was on the hearth, curled in a tight ball, its tail covering its nose. The fire was crackling, and the kettle was singing, and the room was warm and soft and full of the smell of lavender and wood smoke. "I wondered if you would come," Margaret said, without looking up from her book. "I thought you might need to know the rest of the story." Clara sat down in the chair opposite Margaret, and she waited. The fire crackled, the kettle sang, the cat shifted in its sleep. Margaret closed her book, and she set it down, and she looked at Clara, her eyes bright and clear, her face lined with the years. "I was not always old," she said. "I was not always alone. I was married, once, to a man named Thomas. He was a fisherman, like his father before him, like his grandfather before him. He had been born on the sea, and he had lived on the sea, and he had loved the sea, and the sea had loved him, in its way, the way the sea loves everything, indifferently, relentlessly, without mercy." She paused, and she took a sip of her tea, and she looked out the window, at the gray sky, at the gray sea, at the gulls wheeling and crying. Thomas went out on a stormy night in November of 1889. The weather had been bad for days, but the fish were running, and the men were desperate, and the boat was sound, and the sea was the sea, and they went out, and they did not come back. Clara felt a cold hand close around her heart. She had heard stories like this, stories of Whitby's fishermen, stories of the sea that claimed them, stories of the women who waited on the pier, watching the horizon, watching the waves, watching the clouds, waiting for a boat that would never come home. "I waited for 3 days," Margaret said. "I stood on the pier, in the rain and the wind and the cold, and I watched the sea. I watched the waves, and I watched the horizon, and I watched the clouds, and I waited. And on the 3rd day, I knew that he was not coming back. I knew it in my bones, in my blood, in the place where the sea had taken him, the place where the sea had taken a part of me." She set down her cup, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she looked at Clara, her gaze steady and calm. "I did not know what to do with the grief. I did not know how to carry it. I could not make it smaller, and I could not make it larger, and I could not make it go away. I was a confectioner, like you. I had learned the trade from my mother, and she had learned it from her mother, and we had always made the same sweets, the same colors, the same shapes, the same tastes. But after Thomas died, I could not make them anymore. I could not make the colors I had made before. They were too bright, too cheerful, too full of the life that I had lost." She paused, and she looked out the window again, at the sea, at the light that was beginning to break through the clouds. "One night, I was sitting in my kitchen, and I had the copper pan on the stove, and I had the sugar and the water and the cream of tartar and the glucose, and I was stirring and I was weeping, and I was not thinking about the color, and I was not thinking about the recipe, and I was not thinking about anything except the grief that was so deep and so vast that it could not be measured in any unit that we have. And as I stirred, the syrup began to change. It turned gray, and then it turned blue, and then it turned the color of the sea in the hour before the storm. And I knew that I had made something that I had never made before, something that came from the grief, something that was the grief, something that was the color of the sea's darkness, and the sea's light, and the sea's indifference, and the sea's mercy. She looked at Clara, and her eyes were full of the same depth, the same wisdom, the same quiet, patient understanding. "That is how I found the recipe," she said. "That is how I found the color. I did not find it in a book. I did not find it in a ledger. I found it in the grief, in the tears, in the moment when I let myself feel the storm. And that is what I was trying to tell you, the night you came to see me. You cannot make the color of the sea in the hour before the storm until you have let yourself feel the storm. You cannot make it until you have let yourself weep." Clara sat in the warm, dim room with the fire crackling and the cat purring and the kettle singing, and she felt the tears welling up again, not the tears of grief, but the tears of understanding, the tears of recognition, the tears of the sea's forgiveness. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you for telling me." Margaret smiled, and she reached out and took Clara's hand, and she held it, her fingers warm and dry and strong. "You do not need to thank me," she said. "You just need to keep making the candy. You just need to keep stirring and keep weeping and keep letting the sea teach you the rest. The sea is patient, and the sea is relentless, and the sea is always there, waiting for you like the tide." Clara walked home through the streets of Whitby, the thin sunlight falling on the wet cobblestones, the gulls crying overhead, the smell of salt and fish and tar in the air. She walked slowly, her hands in her pockets, her head bowed, her mind full of Margaret's story, full of the grief that had been carried, full of the color that had been found. She reached the house on Flowergate, and she unlocked the door, and she stepped inside. The kitchen was quiet, the fire burned down, the copper pan sitting on the stove, cold and empty. She lit the gas lamp, and she stood in the middle of the room, looking at the work table, at the ledger, at the tin that held the candy she had made, the candy that was the color of the sea. She had made it once. She could make it again. She could make it 100 times, 1,000 times, as many times as she needed to. But she knew that she did not need to make it again. Not now. She needed to let it go, to let the candy be what it was, to let the grief be what it was, to let herself be what she was. She walked to the work table, and she opened the ledger, and she turned to the page with the recipe for the unnamed sweet. She took a pen, and she dipped it in the ink, and she wrote, in her own hand, below the instruction that had baffled her for 3 years, the words that Margaret had given her, the words that she had finally understood. "Stir until the color is that of the sea in the hour before the storm, and then stop, and let the sea do the rest." She closed the ledger, and she set the pen down, and she stood for a moment, looking at the copper pan, the pan that had been her mother's, the pan that had been her grandmother's, the pan that had been handed down from one generation to the next. She reached out, and she touched it, the cool, smooth, copper surface, the handle that had been worn smooth by 100 years of stirring, the rim that had been dented by 1,000 pounds of sugar. She lifted the pan from the stove, and she carried it to the sink, and she washed it, carefully, with warm water and a soft cloth, wiping away the residue of the syrup, the residue of the grief, the residue of the color. She dried it, and she set it back on the stove, and she looked at it, clean and empty and waiting. She walked to the tin, and she lifted the lid, and she looked at the candy inside, the candy that was the color of the sea in the hour before the storm, the candy that was the color of the sea in the hour after the storm, the candy that was the color of the sea's forgiveness, the color of the sea's peace. She broke off a piece, and she put it in her mouth, and she let it dissolve on her tongue, the salt and the darkness and the light, the taste of the grief that had been carried, the taste of the grief that had been released, the taste of the sea that was always there, patient and relentless, like the tide. But she swallowed, and she felt the tears welling up. But they were not the tears of grief, not the tears of loss, not the tears of the storm. They were the tears of letting go, the tears of surrender, the tears of the moment when you finally stop fighting the tide and let it carry you, wherever it is going. She closed the tin, and she carried it to the pantry, and she set it on the shelf, next to the jars of jam and the tins of biscuits and the bags of sugar. She did not need to make the candy again. She did not need to hold on to it. She could let it be, and she could let herself be, and she could let the sea do the rest. She went upstairs, and she undressed, and she climbed into bed, and she lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the night, the wind, the rain, the sea. She felt the weight of the day, the weight of the grief, the weight of the letting go, and she felt herself sinking into the mattress, into the pillows, into the darkness, into the sea. She did not fight it. She did not try to hold on. She let herself sink, and she let herself drift, and she let the sea carry her, wherever it was going. Sleep came. It did not ask permission. It did not knock at the door. It did not wait for Clara to be ready. It came like the tide, slowly, steadily, inexorably, filling the spaces that had been empty, covering the rocks that had been exposed, washing away the footprints that had been left in the sand. Clara felt the first wave of it as she lay in the darkness, her eyes closed, her breath slowing, her heart beating in a rhythm that was not quite her own. She felt the warmth of the blankets, the softness of the pillow, the coolness of the air on her face. She felt the weight of her body, the weight of the day, the weight of the grief, the weight of the letting go, and she felt herself sinking into the mattress, into the pillows, into the darkness, into the sea. The second wave came, and she felt herself drifting away from the shore, away from the house, away from the street, away from the town, away from everything that she had known, everything that she had held, everything that she had been. She felt the current pulling her, gently, softly, patiently, and she did not resist. She let the current take her, and she let the sea carry her, and she let the darkness hold her. The third wave came, and she felt the world dissolve, the sounds of the night fading, the thoughts of the day fading, the memories of the years fading, until there was nothing left but the darkness, and the warmth, and the rhythm of her breath, and the rhythm of the sea that was always there, patient and relentless, like the tide. She was not asleep, not yet. She was in the space between sleeping and waking, the space where the boundaries dissolve, where the past and the present and the future are all the same, where the grief and the joy and the loss and the love are all the same, where the sea is the sea, and the sky is the sky, and the wind is the wind, and she is herself, and she is not herself, and she is everything and nothing. She felt the copper pan in her hands, the cool, smooth copper surface, the handle that had been worn smooth by 100 years of stirring. She felt the weight of the sugar, the water, the cream of tartar, the glucose, the pinch of salt. She felt the heat of the gas, the flame, the bubbling, the hissing, the stirring, the stirring, the stirring. She felt the color forming, the gray, the blue, the deep, luminous blue, the color of the sea in the hour before the storm. She felt the grief rising, the tears falling, the storm breaking, the sea opening, the color becoming what it was meant to be. And then she felt the release, the letting go, the surrender, the moment when the grief became something else, something that she could carry, something that she could hold, something that she could let go of, something that she could keep, something that was hers, and something that was not hers, something that was the sea's, and something that was her own. The fourth wave came, and she was asleep. She did not dream, she did not think, she did not feel. She was simply there, in the darkness, in the warmth, in the rhythm of her breath, in the rhythm of the sea that was always there, patient and relentless, like the tide. She slept. The night passed over Whitby like a slow, dark tide, moving through the streets, the alleys, the harbor, the cliffs, the abbey. The rain fell, and the wind blew, and the sea rose and fell, and the houses slept, and the boats slept, and the gulls slept, and the world slept, and Clara slept. She slept through the hours of the night, through the deep, dark hours when the world is at its most still, when the stars are hidden behind the clouds, when the only sound is the rain and the wind and the sea. She slept through the hour when the tide turned, when the water began to recede, leaving the rocks wet and the sand dark and the seaweed glistening in the moonlight that did not come. She slept through the hour when the wind shifted from the north to the east, carrying the smell of the open sea, the smell of the deep water, the smell of the places where the fish swam and the whales sang and the storms were born. She did not dream, or if she did not remember. She was simply there, in the darkness, in the warmth, in the rhythm of her breath, in the rhythm of the sea that was always there, patient and relentless, like the tide. The hours passed, one by one, like the waves that broke against the shore, like the drops of rain that fell from the sky, like the breaths that she took and released, in and out, steady and slow and deep. At some point in the small hours of the morning, the rain stopped, the wind died, the clouds began to break, and the stars appeared one by one, pale and distant, shining through the gaps in the cloud cover. The moon rose, a thin crescent, casting a faint, silver light across the water, across the rooftops, across the windows of the houses, across the copper pan that sat on the stove in the kitchen of the house on Flowergate. The pan was cold, it was empty, it was waiting, and Clara slept. She slept through the first light of dawn, the gray light that crept over the horizon, that filled the sky, that touched the sea, that turned the water from black to gray to silver. She slept through the sound of the first gulls, the first cries, the first calls, the first stirrings of the day. She slept through the sound of the milkman's cart, the rattle of the wheels, the clatter of the bottles, the soft, steady footsteps of the horse. She slept through the sound of the church bells, ringing the hour, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock. She slept through the sound of the sea, the constant, rhythmic sound of the waves, breaking against the shore, again and again, patient and relentless, like the tide. And then, at some point, she opened her eyes. The light was soft and gray, filtering through the curtains, filling the room with a pale, gentle glow. The air was cool and damp, carrying the smell of the sea, the smell of the rain, the smell of the morning. She lay still, her body heavy and warm, her mind quiet and clear, and she listened to the sounds of the day, the sounds of the town, the sounds of the world that was waking up around her. She did not need to move. She did not need to think. She did not need to do anything except be there, in the bed, in the room, in the house, in the town, in the world, in the sea that was always there, patient and relentless, like the tide. She closed her eyes, and she breathed, and she let the morning settle around her, like a blanket, like a wave, like the color of the sea in the hour after the storm. Clara rose from the bed slowly, her limbs still heavy with the sleep that had held her, her mind still quiet with the peace that had come. She walked to the window, and she pulled back the curtain, and she looked out at the sea. The sky was clear, a pale, washed blue, and the sun was low in the east, casting a long, golden light across the water. The sea was calm, the surface smooth and silver, touched with the gold of the morning, the color of the sea in the hour after the storm, the color of the sea's forgiveness, the color of the sea's peace. She stood there for a long time, watching the light change, watching the gulls wheel and cry, watching the fishing boats move out of the harbor, their sails catching the wind, their hulls cutting through the water, leaving thin, white trails behind them. She watched the world wake up, the houses come to life, the smoke rise from the chimneys, the people begin their day. She turned away from the window, and she went downstairs, and she lit the gas lamp, and she made tea. She sat at the work table, the ledger open in front of her, the copper pan on the stove, cold and empty and waiting. She drank her tea, and she ate a piece of bread and butter, and she looked at the recipe that she had written, the words that she had added, the words that had come from the grief, the words that had come from the sea. Stir until the color is that of the sea in the hour before the storm, and then stop, and let the sea do the rest. She smiled, and she closed the ledger, and she set it aside. She did not need to make the candy today. She did not need to make it tomorrow. She could make it whenever she wanted, whenever she needed, whenever the sea called her, whenever the grief rose, whenever the color came. She finished her tea, and she washed the cup, and she set it on the draining board. She walked to the pantry, and she took out the tin that held the candy that was the color of the sea, the candy that was the color of the grief, the candy that was the color of the forgiveness, the color of the peace. She broke off a piece, and she put it in her mouth, and she let it dissolve on her tongue, the salt and the darkness and the light, the taste of the sea, the taste of the morning, the taste of the life that she was living, the life that she was learning to live, the life that was hers, and the life that was the sea's, and the life that was the color of the sea in the hour after the storm. She put the tin back in the pantry, and she walked to the door, and she put on her coat and her scarf and her hat. She stepped outside, into the cool, clear morning, into the golden light, into the smell of the sea, and she walked down the street, towards the harbor, towards the pier, towards the cottage at the end of the pier, where Margaret was sitting in the window, watching the gulls, watching the sea, watching the morning. She did not need to go to the cottage. She did not need to talk to Margaret. She could walk, and she could breathe, and she could be, and that was enough. She walked to the end of the pier, and she stood on the stones, looking out at the sea that was calm and silver and gold, the sea that was patient and relentless, the sea that was always there, waiting for her, like the tide. And she let the morning light fill her, and she let the sea carry her, and she let the color of the sea in the hour after the storm be the color of her life, the color of the grief that she had carried, the color of the grief that she had released, the color of the sea's forgiveness, the color of the sea's peace. The copper pan was waiting, on the stove, in the kitchen, on Flowergate. But she did not need it today. She did not need it tomorrow. She could make the candy whenever she wanted, whenever she needed, whenever the color came. And the color would come. The sea was always there, patient and relentless, like the tide. The end.